Thank you, Judith. Could I just acknowledge and recognise the previous people who have been mentioned, and can I just reassure everybody that the guns that Judith was talking about weren't real, they were replica, so I think that's important to point out. So, as Judith said, I will be discussing the role of policing in our new security environment and what that actually means, particularly the wider impacts on policing and where does public safety fit into the policing role. So I'll outline the threat that exists as well as some of the changes that have appeared since we've entered this new environment, and I'll discuss some of the evidence that is out there that brings to discussion issues such as fear of terrorism and fear of being a victim of crime. Being a New South Wales police officer, I will concentrate on New South Wales, but this is particularly the same for Australia, notably Victoria and Queensland. So let me begin by setting the scene, and the way I tend to look at it is break this into three phases. So the first phase being pre-9/11, the middle phase 9/11 to September 2014, and then post-2014. So in the pre-9/11 phase, just very, very, very briefly, terrorism, it was largely motivated by international conflict, and it wasn't really related to Australia, but targets in Australia were generally those that had an international interest. And this can even be seen in the first recorded terrorist attack in Australia, which was in January 1915 in Broken Hill. We also, pre-9/11, had some people who trained in terrorist tactics here in Australia in preparation for offshore attacks. And they became known eventually as foreign fighters, is the label that was given to them. And we know that there were Australian citizens who at that time went offshore and fought in conflicts, particularly in Afghanistan, Pakistan and Yemen. And statistically speaking, we identified 30 Australian citizens who were involved in hostile activities in Afghanistan. 25 of those people returned, and 8 of those have since been convicted of terrorism. Pre-9/11, we didn't have terrorism-specific legislation in New South Wales. So in the phase between 9/11 and September 2014, we started to see an increase in attacks around the world against Western interests. For us, Australian interests offshore, notably in Indonesia, and generated a lot by JI. So we know there was Bali in 2002 and Bali in 2005. There was an attack on Marriott Hotel in 2003 and one in 2009 in which Australian citizens were killed. Australian Embassy in Jakarta in 2004 and the Ritz-Carlton bombing as well in 2009. On Australian soil, there were 4 attacks that were identified and disrupted during that phase. That included Operation Pendennis, which was an Al-Qaeda-inspired attack planning on Holsworthy Army Base. And that one involved the now infamous Khalid Sharif. So going back to 2005. There was also another one, which was actually the one at Holsworthy Army Barracks, which was Operation Neath, which was an Al-Shabaab-inspired attack. So although there weren't any successful terrorist attacks on Australian soil between that period of time, 9/11 was still a significant shock for us all. But what really brought it home was Bali, the Bali bombing in 2002, where 88 Australians were killed. That began the new reality of the global terrorist environment, but that reality was still largely offshore. So we now go to the last phase, which is post-September 2014. And I've chosen this period because on the 12th of September that year, this is when the national terrorism threat level changed from medium to high for the first time since 9/11. And that assessment is basically telling us whether or not there's a likelihood of an attack an act of terrorism going to occur. Now, the fact that it went to high, I think in hindsight we now look and say that was actually a very good call by our security agencies because there was a very good reason for doing that, as we've seen. That system has changed and it's now known as probable, but it's the same sort of likelihood. And what that really means is that we in Australia, we now have credible intelligence to say that there are people who have an intent to attack Australia in Australia and have the capability to attack Australians in Australia. And the words intent and capability are very, very important for the terrorism environment. And this is where one of the biggest changes has happened, because pre-September 2014, the sorts of attacks that we were seeing and we were planning for were large scale. They involved massive icons, they involved a lot of attack planning, maybe even chemicals and IEDs, and large numbers of casualties were the flavour of those sorts of attacks. And I remember a former commander of counter-terrorism saying when I took over in 2012, the Sydney Harbour Bridge is still standing, so we're doing our job. Now, what has changed is that gap between intent and capability has narrowed so significantly that there really isn't any gap. Everyone has capability now. That's the big change. In the world of terrorism and looking at terrorism, that's the fundamental difference. Some of the other drivers, though, for the level going up to high was clearly the intensification of activities in Syria and Iraq, the self-proclaimed caliphate by al-Baghdadi in June 2014, and the number of Australian citizens we started to identify in Syria and Iraq who were involved in the conflict. We also, at the end of 2013, we identified a facilitation network involving a person by the name of Al-Qudsi. He has since been convicted of facilitating the travel of 7 Australian citizens to Iraq and Syria to fight in prescribed terrorist organisations. At that time, that organisation was Jabhat al-Nusra, and then later some of these people joined Islamic State. So that's what we were looking at. Foreign fighters was our concern. Now they're still a concern, but they're actually not the main concern. So currently we have about 110 Australians still engaged in hostilities offshore in Syria and Iraq, and we think that the figure is probably about 220 have travelled and have been engaged in the conflict. We have statistics that say about 66 Australians have been killed there. 40 have returned. Some of them remain significant security concern, and we've of recent times charged one of those people with a terrorism offence. So in addition to the foreign fighters, the other issues that we then confronted with post-September 2014 were, we've had 5 attacks now in Australia, that's New South Wales and Victoria, and we've disrupted 13 terrorist attack planning, again mostly in New South Wales and Victoria. And the vast majority of these have been either directed, enabled or inspired by Islamic State. We now have 74 people before the court on terrorism charges, and a massive amount of intelligence and operations going on in the background. Just very, very quickly, in 2014 we saw the antics of Sharif and Elamar offshore in Iraq and Syria. We saw Newman Hayder, who attacked 2 police officers in Melbourne, and Newman Hayder was shot dead. He had been under investigation and he had recently had his passport cancelled. In New South Wales, we conducted Operation Appleby, which involved 16 young males from southwestern Sydney who we alleged had an intention initially to be involved in trying to go offshore and join the fight offshore, but that evolved to conducting an attack here. It was the first high-profile terrorism operation we had done where we actually acted in the interests of public safety ahead of the interests of our investigation, meaning we still had a lot of investigation to do. We didn't have enough evidence to put people before a court. We knew that. We normally would not act, but we had to act in the interests of public safety. Now, fast forward, we do this all the time now in terrorism investigations. But at that time, we did 25 warrants, we arrested many people, we used preventative detention orders, but we only charged 2 people, and that actually became the story. And we actually received a bit of criticism over that. Overkill, you know, this was a flash in the pan, this was a couple of disillusioned youth rebelling. We understand why we received that criticism and that type of response, because this was unusual and it was the first of its kind. Fast forward to now, 15 of those people are now facing court on serious terrorism charges. We didn't have the information at the time, but we now have it and they're before the court. And going through the other attacks, of course, in 2014 we had Martin Place. In 2015 we had Curtis Cheng, New South Wales employee who was killed outside police headquarters, and several other attacks that were prevented. Mother's Day, Anzac Day, Christmas Day, and most recently the aviation industry. So what does this tell us for policing particularly? So we are increasingly being influenced by events overseas, and many of these events are outside our control. The threat environment continues to evolve rapidly, and our operational tempo is continuing to increase significantly. There's no one threat profile that dominates, but what we are most likely to see is a lone wolf or a small group of people with rudimentary capability, little planning or equipment, unpredictable, self-radicalised, and with an intent probably inspired by propaganda. Such a person can be very, very difficult for law enforcement alone to identify. The propaganda, it comes in many forms, such as magazines like Inspire from Al-Qaeda, Dabiqa Rumia from IS, but they have the ability to attract supporters, provide inspiration, provide tactical information, and validate radicalised thoughts. And much of this propaganda, it's transmitted online, social media, internet, etc. And so this has resulted in a lot more people becoming engaged and radicalised and recruited like we've never experienced before. In the days of the conflict in Afghanistan, the reach back into the bedroom of a person in southwestern Sydney would have been minimal. The reach back into the bedroom of a person in southwestern Sydney now from Iraq and Syria is instantaneous. And we saw during the Lindt siege, in fact, Mohammed Elamar, when he was still alive, was actually tweeting live during the siege. So such methods are becoming more and more prevalent and more difficult for us to identify. And a lot of the people who are using them are tech savvy. The threat to people in authority, such as police and defence personnel, has also increased, and we've seen this by evidenced by attacks around the world on both police and army personnel. We've had to change our police tactics as a result, so we've now trained the majority of our first responders in active armed offender tactics, and we are on the path to issuing rifles now to our police. We're also on the path to looking at methods and training for hostile vehicle mitigation. All those sorts of trainings were not on the radar 4 years ago. So in parallel with these events, there's been a significant shift in the focus, what we're all supposed to be focusing on to ensure public safety. And I'll just go through a few of these. So we now have a focus on CVE, countering violent extremism, intervention programs, hotlines, support lines, a whole range of strategies designed to prevent people from becoming radicalised. We have a focus now on fixated persons, and in fact we now have a dedicated unit where people who might be showing obsessive tendencies is a group of people we now might investigate. We have a focus on crowded places with a new national strategy about how we should deal with crowded places, how we mitigate attacks. And there's been debate around what that means in terms of bollards and security measures, so for instance at sporting events. We've got a focus now on critical infrastructure from the Commonwealth. We've got a continuing focus on aviation and mass passenger transport, which are still attractive targets. We've got a focus on youth. We've seen that the age group has trended down quite considerably. So in 2013, the number of our targets who were in that 15 to 25 age group were about 15%. 2016, it's 45%. Interestingly, the at-risk indicators of youth that we normally look at, who we would say are potentially going down a path of crime, are not necessarily present in the youth that we're looking at in terms of radicalisation. That's drugs, homelessness, domestic violence, unemployment. Those indicators are not necessarily relevant or prevalent in the people that we've come across. There's a focus now on technology and the internet, propaganda, extremist material, cybercrime, and in fact at the COAG meeting tomorrow, this is one of the areas that the Prime Minister and the Premiers across our states and territories will be discussing. There's a focus on prison radicalisation, which is an ongoing debate about what we do with people who are radicalised and in prisons. There's a focus on community engagement and what that actually means and what is genuine engagement versus consultation versus tick a box. There's a focus on citizenship. There's a focus on cancellation of passports and migrants and refugees. Importantly, there's also been a focus on legislation. So since 9/11, we now have 70 anti-terrorism laws enacted specifically about terrorism, and there are more to come. The laws not only criminalise the commission of terrorist acts, but they establish a long list of preparatory, group-based and financing offences. They also involve mechanisms to curb behaviour, such as control orders and preventative detention orders, and to detain in custody. So recently in New South Wales, we had a new law which enables us now to go one further than we have ever been able to go. Our oath of office, our office of constable, gives us the right to deprive somebody of their liberty, to put them before the court to face a charge. The new legislation in New South Wales gives us the right to arrest a person who we suspect might be planning attack and to detain them for the purpose of investigation for up to 14 days. It's a fundamental shift in our ability to detain somebody for that amount of time. There are new terrorism powers, particularly around if we're in a confrontation with a person who might be committing a terrorist attack. There's new powers regarding preventative action, new powers regarding data retention. There are new powers around money laundering, around parole, about post-sentence detention and the deployment of the Defence Force. There will soon be new legislation to address cybercrime, encryption and monitor data, more data. So what does this mean? What are the consequences and what is the mark of success? Well, with regard to an attack, there's definitely an expectation that law enforcement will get it right and will get it right all the time. But we can't watch or monitor everyone 24 hours, 7 days a week. So we must use a risk-based model to look at intent and capability, likelihood and consequence. Now this will inevitably mean that there will be some people who there might be an expectation, particularly in retrospect, we should have been watching. But if we did have a model where we pursued every red flag, we would need to, at a minimum, surveil hundreds and hundreds of people 24/7. And that's just the minimum of what we would need. To do that, we would need further legislation, further technology, and the list goes on. Now, is that what's needed? Is that what's wanted? I don't think so. But maybe it means that we have to have a new way of looking at what success means, particularly around community involvement, community expectation, reassurance, and resilience. It means we've got to look at the full dimension of police strategies and interactions. No longer can we have traditional investigative approaches. We need to be able to have powers so we can disrupt and interrupt, suppress, contain, detain, and control. It also means we need to be incredibly adaptable and responsive. For instance, following various releases of editions of the magazines I mentioned, quite often there is a call for an attack on Australian interests, Sydney Opera House, Town Hall Railway Station, whatever it might be. We have to be able to respond immediately. We have to also be anticipating this and to be prepared. It means we've got to be a step ahead with regard to cyber security and work through the data revolution. We've got to understand what the Internet of Things is going to bring. But how much are people prepared to give up? Anyway, so I've outlined a couple of aspects of the police and the environment and the impacts, just a few, that it's already having. But there are lots and lots of other questions and issues that need further exploration, and these are all far bigger than policing. They are about government, they're about community, they're about the individual, they're about rights, democracy, media, so forth. But the threat environment that we talk about is subsumed into this bigger picture, which leads to which. What we do know is that the fear of terrorism is like other serious crimes we deal with, in that the fear of being a victim is far, far greater than actually being a victim. Similarly, measures and perceptions of success or failure differ when we consider different events, such as deaths caused by domestic violence or car crashes. We have a duty not only to protect life and reduce crime, but to also reduce the fear of crime. How will we do that? We don't really know. And how possible is that for us to really do that alone? We clearly tend to argue for more powers, and why wouldn't we? It helps us mitigate the risks. Why wouldn't we continue to ask for more and more powers? But is this really where the investment should be, or should it be directed to other issues before it becomes a police issue? Where do we start? One of the conflict-ridden areas of this bigger picture is the focus on Islam and terrorism. There may be a fear of terrorism, but for reasons which should be inexplicable, it is linked to the threat of Islam. I don't profess to know much about Islam, but I do see a red herring when it's there. At the most, what we see from Islamic State is, and other prescribed terrorist organisations, is this warped perversion of a noble religion. So what can we do about this? So people in this room will have better answers than me, academics, experts, everybody. They'll have good views, good ideas. One thing we can do is actually look at the facts. So the Global Terrorism Index is a great place to start. It's produced annually. It's a comprehensive study which accounts for the direct and indirect impact of terrorism in 163 countries in the world, and it covers 99.5% of our population. It looks at lives lost, it looks at injuries, property damage, and the psychological impact of terrorism and its after effects. So it tells us that we're not alone, that the rest of the world, particularly the Western world, liberal democratic countries, is going through exactly the same thing. It also tells us in 2015, deaths from terrorism decreased by 10% and has been the first decrease for many years. However, in OECD countries, it's increased, and that's mainly because of attacks in Turkey and France. We're seeing, it hasn't yet been measured, it hasn't yet come out this year, but we'll see another decline. The interesting information, though, is that the majority of deaths from terrorism do not occur in the West. So they don't occur in Australia, they don't occur in Europe, they don't occur in the United States. In fact, excluding 9/11, 0.5% of all deaths have occurred in Western countries in the last 15 years. One would think, from what we hear and what we see, it would be far greater. One would think that figure, from 0.5%. The report highlights the prevalence of lone wolf attacks in the West, however. Such attacks account for 70% of all terrorist deaths in the West in the last 11 years. And importantly, Islamic fundamentalism is not a primary driver of these attacks. And in fact, 80% are attributed to a mixture of right-wing extremists, nationalists, anti-government elements, and other types of political extremism. So it's a bit different to what we sometimes read in the paper and what we think and what we hear. But it doesn't really resonate, does it? And where should it be resonating? With our leaders, in the media, in public debate? I don't know, but it's not resonating. And we're seeing this not just with terrorism, we're seeing this across the board in a lot of other areas. So for instance, there's a new world order evidenced by Trump and Brexit, refugee crisis, the lessening of democracy in several countries, Poland, Hungary, for instance. There's a rise of ultranationalism, there's uncertainty, there's a sense of darkness, there's fear and there's doom, and there's vicious public commentary perpetuated by a 24/7 social media world, which inhibits a lot of the conversation that might otherwise occur. So I guess we could say, how do we cope? But of course we do, and we have to, and generations before us have coped with harsher environments or similar environments. Which leads me to my final reality. We are actually better off, notwithstanding the current terrorism threat. So let me just tell you a quick story about Bill Gates, who very recently, I don't know if any of you follow his blog, but very recently he and other influential people got together in New York at the Goalkeepers event. So Gates said, I woke up, this was only a few weeks ago, I woke up this morning and like most days I read the news, it's grim, hurricanes in the Americas have killed dozens of people and displaced far more. Mexico is recovering from its most powerful earthquake in a century. North Korea is threatening its neighbours. The civil war in Syria seems to have no end. These days, a lot of people look at the headlines and think the world is falling apart. I have a different view. I think the world is far from falling apart. In fact, it has never been better, more peaceful, more prosperous, safe or just. And I'm on a mission to prove it. And he went on to say, and quote from Bill Clinton, it doesn't mean that you ignore the problems of the world, but you've got to look beyond the headlines and look for the trend lines. So just a few little things about that I thought I'd finish with. So our lifespan, it's doubled in the last 100 years. There's been extraordinary achievements in tackling malaria, pneumonia, HIV, nutrition, diarrhoea, sanitation, availability of food and clean water. People are living healthier lives across the world generally. Extreme poverty has been cut in half. Millions of children's lives have been saved. There are actually less conflicts across the world than ever before. And the only thing that has gone down faster than violence is people's willingness to accept violence. And there's actually more freedom. Regimes have a much harder time suppressing knowledge, and freedom of speech has been boosted by our 24/7 social media cycle. So I guess the message is that we do live in an environment where there is fear and where there is threat. And every incident that occurs adds to that. Las Vegas, it adds to that. But it's important to convince people that things are improving, and we just need to find other ways or creative ways of doing this. And the same message needs to apply to terrorism and the fear of terrorism. Public safety is paramount, and we will do everything we can, but there are many ways to achieve this, not just through policing. Thank you.